Thinking back to episode 4, the proverbial keg upon which Portage's Métis community was balancing exploded when Ho-Chunks were forcibly expelled across the Mississippi in 1840. When it blew, it wasn't a surprise, and it is thus not surprising that we see Portage's Métis families planning for which side of the roof they would choose when the time came. Their cultural landing place may not prove to be permanent as the decades unfolded, but those lines started appearing already in the midst of the decade. But before things went down, Portage's Métis community was tied up in the short-term results of the notorious 1837 treaty, which acquired all remaining Ho-Chunk lands in Wisconsin. The extent of mixed-blood ancestral rights during this era of land cessions was a nebulous matter. In 1829 and 1832, land tracts were granted within the ceded territory to some mixed-blood families as an incentive for Ho-Chunks to acquiesce, and perhaps as a bribe for Métis to advise their kin to sell. The 1837 treaty went a different direction. Rather than carving out land grants, part of the tribe's cash payment was rerouted to Métis people. To collect, these families were called to Prairie du Chien to testify of their connections and services to the Ho-Chunk nation. A strange yet invaluable result is that we are personally introduced to these families and their stories by sworn affidavit. These affidavits reveal glimpses into how they had been navigating the beginning rumblings of tumult. As waves of famine, disease, and the beginnings of forced displacement rocked Ho-Chunk communities in the preceding years, Portage's Métis dug deep into their own limited stores to meet needs. Some were described as figuratively dividing their last loaf with Ho-Chunk kin. Montesi and her daughter Juliette, who now lived at Prairie du Chien, expended their inheritances, Juliette even selling some of her own clothing, to purchase necessities for sufferers, ending up homeless and living with Montesi's Ho-Chunk brother. Pierre Paquette, who initially had more to share, was also called upon for aid. In the words of his wife, Therese,
in 1836, when the smallpox was raging among the tribe of Winnebagos, after he had given all he had to them, he exhausted his credit at Prairie du Chien, and then traveled into far distant places, purchasing supplies for them, by which means the lives of many were saved, but utterly and completely ruined his own fortune and that of his children.
During the time of the first major famine of this decade, Juliette Kinzie recalled,
the half-breed families of the neighborhood, who had, like ourselves, continued to share with the needy as long as their own stock lasted, were now obliged, of necessity, to refuse further assistance. These women often came to lament with us.
Given these hardships, it is logical to assume that they would choose an easier path moving forward when the keg was preparing to burst. Time would reveal that Métis paths were often difficult regardless, but the choices many made may be surprising. Well before the 1840 explosion, we appear to see a shift in Métis Portage's geography. When we started the series, we saw the European contribution largely originating from Green Bay and the Great Lakes beyond. As the 1830s came to a close, a number of the Portage region's Métis were becoming linked with Prairie du Chien on the Mississippi. The center of the fur trade, which brought most of these families to Portage, had moved west as furs became depleted around Portage. But perhaps this is also partly because the family ties which had previously held these families here had shifted in another way. Starting in 1833, the government had begun expulsions of Ho-Chunk people into the Neutral Ground Reservation in Iowa, opposite Prairie du Chien, beginning a geographical shift in the Ho-Chunk nucleus. When the wholesale 1840 forced eviction began, young Métis men including Peter Menage and Antoine Grignon were called into service as translators and guides for the military. Shortly after the smoke cleared, Peter himself removed permanently across the Mississippi. Some chose to remain around Portage, at least for a time, and shelter the winds of change in place. Jean-Baptiste Dubé, a Menominee Métis and son-in-law of Menominee chief Oshkosh, had arrived at Portage as a trader around 1837 to pick up the reins of Paquette's American Fur Company post, and chose to remain local even after the majority of Ho-Chunk clients had been eliminated from the region. Jean de Laronne, who had remarried another Ho-Chunk woman following Agatha's death, opened a farm across the Wisconsin River in Caledonia and settled down. The Couillers and Blondroches, the latter related by marriage to the Menage and Gleason families, were also in the area as of 1849. Some descendants of the Portage Grignons ultimately remained within the larger Wisconsin region. Agency blacksmith William Jourdain melded into Green Bay society alongside a number of Green Bay's Métis, but remained close by Menominee kin. Some became prominent and fairly accepted members of Euro-American society, while others felt the social stigma of so-called half-breed status much more significantly. Staying local in the Portage region meant some measure of integration with settler society, yet it did not necessarily mean relinquishing Ho-Chunk ties. The Portage area was a significant refuge for Ho-Chunks of the Wisconsin Band who sought to remain in their homeland, and Métis stories continued to be heavily intertwined. The dramatic swings experienced in the 19th century by Wisconsin's Ho-Chunk population placed their Métis relatives in a strange succession of situations over the decades, ranging from being called as translators for repeated expulsion efforts, to trading with their indigenous kin, to actively aiding them in their efforts to resist displacement. Jean de Laronne was no stranger to the ridgepole as the decades of the 19th century unfolded. In 1848, he was called up as a messenger to facilitate Ho-Chunk removal to Long Prairie, Minnesota, due to his existing trading relationships. Within a year, he accompanied one of the evictees, Chief Yellow Thunder, to the Mineral Point Land Office to assist in the monumental first Ho-Chunk repurchase of ancestral land near Portage. When the final removal drive came in 1873, he was again intertwined with conflicting roles. Juliette Grignon had avoided public employment in these chapters, but was instrumental as a translator for her Ho-Chunk kin at Portage in their efforts to become owners of homestead land in northern Wisconsin when they became reestablished following the final forced removal. Many, however, did not immediately choose the road of remaining local or assimilating into local settler circles. Toma, the Kinzie family's young Potawatomi Métis servant, had returned to Chicago when the Kinzie family left the agency in 1833. We don't know much of his later life, except that most of the younger Amilandu children, presumably including Toma, were removed with their relatives west of the Mississippi River around 1838, some with indigenous wives whom they'd married. Toma's story also illustrates the complexity of such situations for Métis families. While some of the Mirandu children were evicted to the reservations and chose to live among their indigenous relatives when they came of age, others did not, such as Toma's sisters Madeline and Victoire, who remained in the Milwaukee area with their non-indigenous husbands. Josette Wilmette, unlike Toma, was not directly wrapped up in the Potawatomi expulsion drive west of the Mississippi. Instead, it was her family ties which drew her household to the reservations. She and her siblings, in an 1844 petition requesting government permission to offload treaty-designated land in Illinois, wrote, "The home of your petitioners, with one exception, is at Council Bluffs with the Potawatomi tribe of Indians, with whom we are connected by blood, and that your petitioner cannot, with due regard for their feelings and interests, reside away from their tribe." Although she personally did not marry into the tribe as Toma may have, she lived out the rest of her life at the Potawatomi reservation. European blood sometimes meant that people like Josette did not necessarily have to go to the reservation, offering a level of choice not enjoyed by their indigenous kin. However, mixed blood was by no means a guarantee of security. Following the establishment of a Ho-Chunk reservation on Minnesota's Blue Earth River, the Dakota War of 1862 led to one of the ugliest expulsions up to that time in Ho-Chunk experiences. Mary Gleason, the multilingual youth of Cato's Green Bay Mission School, an adopted daughter of Chief Hujoka, determined that this time she would not follow her kin, and descended the Minnesota River, planning to wait out the war in Green Bay where she had property, and afterward return. At Fort Snelling, the military refused to allow her to leave the boat of Ho-Chunk evictees, forcing her to the new reservation at Crow Creek, South Dakota. The government agent there eventually recognized her right to choose and sent her back to Minnesota, by which time she found her home, belongings, and land taken, forfeited, or destroyed. It was at this point that a number of Métis who thus far remained within the Ho-Chunk sphere chose to get off the roller coaster and become integrated with the settler realm at Blue Earth. Juliette Kinzie's log kitchen building workman, Louis Ménage, for example, had accompanied the removals and continued to work for the agencies in various laboring positions through at least the 1850s. When parts of the reservation were allotted to individual ownership, some of Louis' grown children received homesteads. Although the Dakota War of 1862 left the status of many of these claims in limbo, a number remained and were eventually able to put down roots. Some Métis at Blue Earth, however, were heavily integrated into Ho-Chunk society and continued on. In 1838, Oliver Amel had relocated from the Four Lakes to Prairie du Chien on the Mississippi and stated his distinct decision that he expects to continue living his life among the Winnebagoes, at a time when life among Ho-Chunks did not present a quiet future. Shortly after, his daughter Catherine married French-Canadian Rock River trader Alexander Lemire. Amel, along with his daughter and son-in-law, joined their Ho-Chunk kin when the government changed the location of their reservation from Iowa to Long Prairie, Minnesota. Catherine's grandson recalled that the family afterward made several trips to Wisconsin, finally locating in the vicinity of Madison, paralleling the decision of many of their Ho-Chunk relatives to return to their homeland rather than endure the tense difficulties of the reservation. Their next move did not come as a choice. Around 1859, following Alexander's death, his Métis family was forced to the Blue Earth River country, where the Ho-Chunk reservation had again been relocated. Catherine's daughter spoke of this painful chapter of her childhood years later, recalling how brave her brothers Joe and Frank were in trying to alleviate the family's sufferings as young boys. It was not long before the next phase in the family's struggle, as they too became evicted from Minnesota as a result of the Dakota War. A hostile escort separated the women and children of the Ho-Chunk Nation from the men, interning the fathers in camps at Fort Snelling, while their defenseless families were brutally transferred up the Missouri River. In South Dakota's desolate wasteland reservation, Ho-Chunks sought to escape and take refuge with their distant relatives, the Omaha Nation. The Lemire family was among the escapees, fleeing the reservation in dugout canoes and finally arriving in Nebraska after being gunned down along the way by hostile Lakota. Old Oliver Amel himself lived out his final days on the Nebraska Reserve. Grandchildren Frank, Joe, and their siblings followed his decision of decades prior, choosing to cast their lot by life and marriage with Ho-Chunks until they were no longer considered Métis, but fully Ho-Chunk. The youth of Métis Portage came of age in a country which hadn't yet decided whether they were entitled to the rights of citizenship. Initially, some, such as the Paquette children, Moses and Therese, and the Gleason children, William and Eliza, were enrolled in the Ho-Chunk Neutral Ground Reservation School, intended for indigenous non-citizens. For Moses and Therese, their later association with European communities seems to have bypassed the issue of their citizenship. For William and Eliza, they spent their neutral ground school days taking lodging with agency staff and in the school boarding house. Coming of age, both remained within Ho-Chunk society and followed the Ho-Chunk Treaty Trail to the Long Prairie and Blue Earth reservations. For those with an association with the Treaty Trail west of the Mississippi and its reservations, citizenship was by no means automatic. For Landroches, Menages, Lecuyiers, Gleason, and Julia Grignon's son, David, citizenship came in 1870, only after they had met specific cultural criteria for the recognition. Citizenship on paper was one matter. Acceptance in society was an additional hurdle which was not yet overcome. We've merely scratched the surface of the experiences of individuals who chose to cast their lots with their Ho-Chunk relatives. We've surveyed challenges for those who determined to absorb into Euro-American society. We've investigated stories of those who wove their way through both worlds in various chapters of life. Perhaps more often than not, the generation which came of age at Métis Portage never really left the roof when the keg blew. Their descendants, though, made choices in their footsteps, some shutting away the social stigma of their ethnicity, others building their distinct Métis culture regardless of opinion, and still others becoming so integrated into their parent indigenous culture that eventually they were no longer Waqalpinikesak, but Ho-Chunk. This extended look at Métis Portage has cracked open the lid of many lives which are all but forgotten today. Perhaps this bird's eye view of Le Portage Métis can help us appreciate the variety, color, individuality, and depth of the personal experiences, which can be so easily painted over and lost with the stigmas and generalizations which quarantined these stories for so long. Join us in episode 7 as we take one more giant step back and consider another meaning of Métis.